Just move now on to our last presentation of the conference. Frank Harris is going to talk to us about the lost radioactive source capsule. And from what I've heard over the week, it's a talk that a lot of people have been looking forward to, Frank. So no pressure.
No pressure. Congratulations. You've made it. Last talk. I understand my brief. Try and keep people awake. So I guess, we're going to go through it. So yeah, it was an interesting time. Last year, I had a bit of fun, just a little 19 gigabecquerel cesium source, which we kind of misplaced for a while. So it was actually a story of two incidents, not one. It actually started back in December when one of our gauges, and it was a relatively new gauge, it was less than 6 months old. It was actually a new plant, new gauge, recently installed, and the top fell out of it and the shield fell out. And we went, oh, that's not good. The site RSO did exactly what he was supposed to do, which is go, oh dear, isolate it, tell the regulator, and get someone who's more experienced than him to fix it, which is what he did. So basically, immediately called the regulatory authority. We already had an international company which actually specialises in gauges come up and put the gauge back together, package it up for us, and then start shipping it off. And that was done on the over the 10th and 11th, and on the 12th to the 15th, the package was sent to Perth, to the yard of the consultants who did the repackaging. And it sat there for 10 days. And then, as always happens, late on a Wednesday. Now, these things normally happen late on a Friday, but this happened late on a Wednesday because in this case, it happened on the 25th of January. The 26th of January is Australia Day, the National Day for Australia, which is a public holiday. And the Friday is renowned as a day where people suddenly become very ill and have a 4-day weekend. Very, very strange. So we were told, and the regulators were told, on Wednesday night before what effectively was a 4-day weekend. Typical timing. I wrote here, the rest is history. Perhaps more accurately, I should have said the proverbial hit the fan is probably the more accurate terminology. Because this had all the elements for a media firestorm. It was sexy. You had this deadly source, lost in the Australian outback, kangaroos running all over the place, and it was grabbed. Within a couple of days, it became a media sensation. It became all around the world. I had people calling me from England, Vienna, America, Africa, saying, what the hell's happening? And it was bigger than Ben-Hur, and it didn't debate. Normally with a media presentation or a media issue, it goes within a day or two, it's gone. A week later, it was still as intense as anything, which of course is really loved by my superiors within Rio Tinto, a global mining company, just what we want to do. The good thing is our approach was one of generally being as open as we could. We have learned lessons from previous areas where we weren't that way, and in this case here, we were very open to the media, and it was instantly also of importance to the governments. Funny, isn't it, how when you have a Prime Minister actually commenting on it, how everyone suddenly becomes very interested in this kind of thing. So there was no real panic or anything associated, but the concern around it became quite amazing. And as I said, it became the front page news. Every paper in Australia was on the front page with quite a few international papers, just exactly where we would love it to be. And as part of this, there were calls. How much is this costing? Who's going to pay for it? Why isn't Rio Tinto paying for all of this? You have to be responsible. Even our Prime Minister, if we go back to the last one of the headlines was Prime Minister slams ridiculously low penalty for mishandling the radioactive source. Joy. Our regulators look at that because the regulatory system isn't designed for something like this. It's not about cost recovery. In fact, there is no mechanism for cost recovery. Even, and I'm giving a bit of a spoiler alert here, even though it was found that we were not at fault in any way or form with this, in the media's attention, in the public's attention, this was Rio Tinto. So in the end, we actually gave a $4 million mining camp to the Western Australian government for flood relief, which was part of it. And we actually got a headline saying we gave an unexpected gift to cover the radioactive capsule. It wasn't designed that way, but it was decided we had to give something back, even though there was no actual mechanism to do it. So yes, it was an interesting time, as they call it. So this was all going on in the background. And like I said, this went on for about a week and a half to 2 weeks until finally we started getting some changes happening. And the big one was around the search and what was done. To give you an idea, we were looking for something which is 8 millimetres by 6 millimetres in size. So if you have an old Parker pen or one of those freebies given away out here, the clicker is the size of what we're looking at. And we only had a small search area. You can see there, rough size of the United Kingdom. And if you go from the top to the bottom, we had about 50% more than that to look for this source. So it was a big area. You know, it was a case of, oh, this is going to be interesting. And the initial search was done at the state level, which means only limited resources. You had people going around with handheld detectors, which have a Geiger-Müller tube in them about this big, and you had people often who were untrained. You had the first responders who are trained to some degree, but really don't have a lot of familiarity with the area. So that was really targeted around areas where we thought it may have fallen off. The loading yards, areas which the public say, oh, we think there's radiation around, that kind of thing. And at that stage, I had to advise my bosses that using this method, at best, we might have a 20% chance of recovery of the source, at best. The good thing is the state regulator activated the National Disaster Plan very, very quickly. Over that 4-day weekend, they managed so that by the Monday, they had the approvals to activate the National Disaster Plan. And what this is a mechanism where we can call on the Commonwealth's aid. So in Australia, you have the states and the Commonwealth. And the Commonwealth allowed us to call in the National Nuclear Regulator, APANSA, call in the National Science Organisation, ANSTO, and also the resources of the Defence Force. And when that did, what they brought in was 2 critical things. One, proper detectors, large volume detectors, 3-inch by 3-inch sodium iodide detectors, gamma cameras, various other bits and bobs. And also brought in teams of experienced people who knew what they were doing to look for these sources. And we had 2 main teams, one led by APANSA, which was going up from Perth, because they like to stay in better hotels, and one which was coming down from the top, which was ANSTO, which started off at Port Hedland and worked their way down. And the good thing about these detectors is they're sensitive, and instantly the chance of success jumped from less than 20 to over 80 to 90%. And as part of this process, we worked out what they could see. Driving along at 80 k's an hour, you could probably see very, very, with no chance of missing it, out 20 metres from the road, and probably 50 metres you still detected. Any more than that, it becomes a little area. We did have Plan Cs, airborne surveys, if it was required. However, within the first day of using the appropriate detectors, it was found. It was found right on the edge of the road, in the middle of, thankfully, one of the remote areas in the Australian outback. I think the nearest centre was approximately about 100 k's away. The nearest dwelling was probably about 30 k's away. The nearest feature was probably 10 k's away, and that was a turn off to nowhere as far as I'm aware. So if you're going to lose a source, that's a good start. It's a great little start to have that. But it was found, and really, I want to stress that this was it did represent government working. I know industry doesn't often say that, but yes, the state, Commonwealth government combined and came up with a solution which worked really, really well. The good news is, and ENZ should be pretty happy. The actual source capsule remained fully intact. There was no release of the material from the double encapsulation. It was a little bit beat up from rolling around the ground, but there was absolutely no loss of any kind of the interior material. And because of the location where it was, the dose to any member of the public was very small. And the reason for that, one, basically the only scenario we could come up where anyone got a reasonable dose was a tourist who happened to stop on that exact area of nowhere and passed the time directly over, which does give a slightly higher dose, actually about 4 times the dose for a woman than a man, for anatomical reasons. But it was good. It was in the exactly right place. The driver got a minuscule dose because this package was on the back of a B double trailer. So there's actually a distance of almost 30 metres distance. So there was quite a bit of distance there. So from that perspective, it was great. I did go, wow, when I found it had been fought. Oh, it was one of those moments where you go, thank God. It was just so intense. But then we move on to the next phase. In some ways, the most interesting phase, which is the investigation, which is to answer 2 questions, plus another question. The 2 questions: what was the root cause? Why did this fail? I've been a health physicist for over 36 years, and I've never heard of something like this happening. I've had gauges which have been lost, rolled over, crushed, stolen, but never one where the source just fell out. So why? 2, how can you stop it? Then, of course, we live in a no-blame culture. So you have the 3rd question. Who do you blame? Always there. So you just, never, of course we never mention that, but it's always there, and I can tell you what, everyone was interested to see. So we've got to look into this. So to explore this a little bit more and to go through what was the cause, I want to talk a little bit. We talk a lot about here and about the young generation, and it's a great thing, getting new people on, new people in radiation protection. And it's good. And I look around the room and there's probably a lot more of us who are probably not quite in the new generation by maybe a couple of decades. And when we look at old versus new, progress is a good thing. Mobile phones. If you go back when I first started, a mobile phone was good for a weightlifting device. It was quite a large, bulky thing which you carry around. Nowadays, you've got iPhones, you've got Samsungs, whatever your choice is, they're great. They're not used as phones anymore, they're basically used as games machines, but they're still an interesting kind of aspect. So progress is a good thing. But when we look at radiation gauges, maybe it isn't quite the right source. Here we have the evolution of gauges, which is actually happening now. If you look on the left, you have what I call the old gauge. Massive cast steel construction, lead in them. Great, you can use them as a wheel chock for a 90-ton dump truck. They're a bit like me, probably not very attractive, a little bit overweight, but they work and they keep on working and nothing really destroys them. But now we're seeing a transition where you've got people coming in saying, we can do better than that. Look, they're horrible things, so we'll design a new one. We've got CAD/CAM programs, we can do this, we can do loading. And so they came up with the design. And of course, our engineers, when we built our plant, wanted the newest possible gauge they could. So they bought one of the new ones, which basically consists of a backing plate, a top plate, a cylinder round, and then the shield inside as its basis, which all sounds good. And rather than it being a cast structure, it's held together using bolts. And this will start telling you where I'm going. The bolts holding it together, supposedly, were going to be 12 M5 by 16 bolts, 6 on the top, 6 on the bottom. Now, for those who don't know what an M5 bolt is, the one which holds your monitor on to your monitor screen is about an M5 bolt. The ones, if you put your big screen into your wall, like your plasma, are normally an M8 bolt, which is far bigger and stronger. So these ones here are about the same size bolt where you have 4 and hold your monitor on. Think about that. Now, there are reasons why they want to go this way. There's a lot of cost reasons, easier to manufacture, all that kind of stuff. And they do. They go through the approval process, do the drop test, do the immersion test, all those kind of things, and it passes. However, when we look at the precision tools, you need to pull these apart. The ones I'm familiar with, I've probably pulled apart over 100 of these old gauges, and our most common tool is the sledgehammer, closely followed by the cold chisel, the impact driver, the crowbar, and of course, WD-40. Without that, it's almost impossible to get them apart. Even with that, sometimes you have to resort to other things, such as using forklifts to help pull things apart and various other things. They are built incredibly well, and they're designed so they protect that source. With the new gauge, you use a hex key. You got to get the hex key with the security headbutt, not a normal hex key. So that's a lot better. So this, to me, raises a couple of questions. And it raises a lot of questions when we look at this incident. And the big one is around vibration. You may wonder, why on earth would he have a picture of a bed? In April of last year, I was pleasantly surprised when I bought a spare bed for my guest room, that when I assembled it, all the bolts had anti-vibration components on it. I'm not suggesting that I hope my guest bedroom is a high vibration zone. I don't normally have those kind of parties, unfortunately. I'm a bit too boring for that. But it's nice to see that even something like a bed, they consider vibration in the design. And when you start looking at it, vibration is an incredibly well-known potential cause of failure. When I gave a similar presentation to Transk last year, I had the person from IATA coming up and saying, duh, planes fell out of the sky till we worked out about vibration. So vibration is a well-known cause of failure. Whenever you use screws or bolts, there is a risk they will undo if you don't consider vibration. Hence the reason why a bed has those nylon washers on. So when we looked at the incidents, the first incident which happened, as I said, this is a new plant, a brand new gauge, had been in service, I think, about 4.5 months. And something happened which I've never heard of before, which is the top plate came off and the 28 kilograms of tungsten shielding fell out and dropped on the bottom, dropped about 2 meters to sit down there. Never really heard of this happening before. And probably one of the faults which I can ascribe to the RSO is they probably didn't escalate within Rio Tinto. And if I had seen it, I would have used probably some colloquial words very quickly and said, oh, this is unusual, we better do something special. However, they did go to the international provider, which was on the list for gauges, someone who was experienced with gauges, pull these gauges apart all the time and reassemble. So they did that. So they then reassembled them after it was made safe, put them in a package and sent them down, which leads us to the second incident. Now, you saw back here, I'm just going back a bit, what one of these gauges looked like on the right. When it arrived in Perth, that's what it looked like. Before I got access to this, because we had to wait till the police let it out before we could get access to it, I went to the local tool shop and bought special hex keys with the security code on them so I could undo everything. I wasted my money. Every single bolt but one had undone. Not broken, had undone. Even the critical grub screw at the end of the source holder was missing, the end screw, and of course the source capsule was in it. And one of the two bolts which held the gauge in place was missing. And in the process of it becoming missing, it left a hole in the overpack. A hole big enough that most of the bolts, most of the screws, and yes, the unshielded source could fall through and come through. So there's a couple of quick learnings here. And one of them was the gauge basically shook itself to its component pieces. I found one screw which was at the cover plate, which was still in there, but even that I could undo by hand. So it literally, every single bolt, bar one, which held onto the bitter end before it snapped. What happened inside that box is one of those two securing bolts had started vibrating and the nut had undone. In the process, it started to move and made the hole it was in bigger. It then fell out when it's fully unscrewed, at which time there was one bolt holding the gauge so it could start moving more violently. The gauge itself was already prone to vibration, and I'll explain a bit more about that in a minute. And it shook itself into its absolute pieces. Like I said, I never expected this. I've never seen anything like this in all my years as a health physicist. I've never even believed that this could happen. When we looked at it and looked at the bolts, there was other stories which were coming out here. As I said, only one remained intact. When we look through them, in the manufacturing of this, they're supposed to use Loctite. They're supposed to put some form of silicon on the top as a filler to prevent vibration. None of this was present. You had the bolts just there. Effectively, it was something waiting to fall apart. And even the bolts themselves, there are inconsistencies. The manufacturer called for M5 by 20 in some documentations, M5 by 16 in some of them. The manufacturer actually used M5 by 12s, and the people who did the repair used M5s by 10, leading to cases where the thread engagement was about 2 to 3 turns of thread, which is not sufficient to hold anything together. When we looked at other gauges, which are still in service at the plant, we found one which was 2 bolts and probably a day away from fouling in a similar manner. You can look there, those bolts had similarly undone themselves in the environment. Other gauges we've heard of within the other users of this particular gauge have had similar type areas of vibration fault. So there's a whole problem around gauge designation, design and manufacture, and then we looked through even the designation was wrong. It was incorrectly labelled. It should have been labelled a DG01. When we looked deeper, we found it was approved as a lead type gauge, but they were selling tungsten gauges. So they were probably 8 kilograms wrong in what they were testing from what they were selling. Due to the differences in density, this has to happen. You can't have lead and tungsten filling the same space and giving the same weight. And it's unlikely that any vibration testing was done in the worst case direction. It would have been done on a horizontal plane or a vertical plane, but not on where the weight is actively pressing against those bolts and effectively operating as a miniature jackhammer. When we looked at packaging, as I said, the packaging looked fine. We've got video of it arriving into Perth, and from the outside, there didn't appear to be any damage to it. It was only if you went underneath or if you opened it where you would have been able to talk about it. One of the things which surprised our regulators, which shouldn't because it's their regulations, is there's no requirement to test whether a source has arrived. There is a requirement to find out whether the package has arrived safely, and if anything happens to the package to report it, but you don't actually actively monitor the TI when you get there to compare it with what's there. When reporting, this led to a delay of 10 days, which, if the source had made it further, could have led to a very, very significant dose. So corrective actions, beware of vibration. And when you get something unusual, such as this happening, don't just treat it as the norm, which is what was done. Seek more help, don't trust the experts, and the word I would use is package the shit out of it. Okay, just don't do the bare minimum as required by the code for transport. If something unusual has happened, then that type A rating may no longer be valid. So I've made a couple of recommendations, probably won't get anywhere. I'll put these up with Transk and whatever, but then also within the Australian system, there needs to be more consideration of vibration. It's a forgotten killer. If you're in planes, even with automobiles, even motorbikes, it's considered. But we don't seem to be considering it that well within the radiation sector. If something unusual has happened, then the rating, which was given that gauge, i.e. type A, shouldn't be considered as still valid. If it's fallen apart and had to be reassembled, is it still a type A material? But the code is, transport regulations are quiet on that. Solid and robust, as I said, if in doubt, do more. And should we be checking, if it's not a routine transport, if there is something which is a bit different, should we be doing a comparing of the pre and post transport index to ensure that what you got isn't a box, but actually is a source? So there's that there. We've engaged design and manufacture, more rigorous and comprehensive mechanical design, consideration of vibration, quality control. We've found the quality control just wasn't there. Don't know why, don't know how, it just wasn't there. There were so many variations from what they said they were going to do. And the testing for vibration should be done in the worst possible place, where the maximum load would occur, not just where it's convenient. So in conclusion, I've been around a while. This is extremely unusual. I've had losses during transport. I've had things stolen. I've never had a gauge spontaneously break down to its component pieces, releasing the source. To say it created significant public, media and government concern is probably an understatement. I would say that it was found due to excellent cooperation between the state and Commonwealth agencies. There was no real dose as a result, but that was luck, not good management. Vibration was the root cause, which can be tracked to the gauge design and manufacturer. So beware the new sometimes. Sometimes new isn't necessarily better. We've got the key learnings we're trying to implement this, but there's a lot of deeper learning which go back to the core regulations, both for transport, for gauge design and gauge manufacture, which need to be looked at. And one of the good things for us is we were investigated. The regulatory authority found that we had had no breaches, that in fact they complimented on our work and our openness during the incident. Who cares? Doesn't really help. We were in a media storm, share price dropped. I had long discussions with our chief executive and the board. But at the end, it comes down to something. When you get something new, think about it, because new doesn't necessarily have to be better. And although everything looks like it's okay, it doesn't necessarily mean it is. Thank you very much for your time.